have to fear is
In war,
fear itself.
there is no substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we've earned, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome to the intersection of faith and politics. This is WallBuilders Live. You can find out more at our website, wallbuilderslive.com and wallbuilders.com. I'm Rick Green here with David Barton. It's Good News Friday. Always looking forward to Fridays, David, and getting some good news from you. Gets me through the weekend and through the next week, knowing we can make a difference and have an impact in what's happening out there in the culture. And you cover a broad array of subjects. So what are we going to start with first for good news today?
Well, we're actually going to start with our own home state. This is a national article that's come out. It was done out of Reuters, and it was picked up by Charisma News. And the headline says, Evangelicals win. Evangelicals win battle. Evangelicals win battle in war. Evangelicals win battle in war over evolution. Evangelicals win battle in war over evolution in Texas biology book.
Wow.
Now, that's a pretty interesting headline, but I've got to take the good news. You know, it's good news for us, not good news for them. I got to take that good news and kind of put it in a little analysis mode here for just a moment. So this is a news story out of Reuters. Now, because I'm involved with the State Board of Education here, I know that headline is totally, completely false. And the reason I know that is the State Board of Education did absolutely zero with evolution in biology. As a matter of fact, what they did was they said that any controversial theory has to have both sides presented. Now, that's what they said, and that's about anything. That could be global warming. But everybody in the media said, oh, that's evolution. They're trying to say evolution's bad and creation's good. No, they said any controversial theory has to have both sides presented. So for this Reuters writer to say evangelicals win battle and war over evolution, Texas biology book, first off, that wasn't the war. The war was, if you're going to do something, we don't want indoctrination. We want you to put both sides out there. So the first thing this would tell me is that we had a publisher who said, I'm only going to give one side of a controversial issue. I don't want to give the other side. So while the headline sounds like it's really good news, there's a whole lot more to the story than the way that somebody spun this headline. And if I can read out of the story here, it's just...
Yeah, because they're trying to make it look like it was just evangelicals forcing their way on a subject, you know, getting instead of, hey, we're trying to get kids to think. We actually want them to have to look at both sides of every subject.
That's exactly it. And there's a ton of controversial stuff in science, not just evolution, but that's all these guys fixate on. And so here's the quote out of the story. It says, in the latest episode of a lengthy battle by evangelicals in Texas to insert Christian and biblical teachings in the public school textbooks, the board on Thursday blocked the book's approval. Now, wait a minute. There's a lengthy battle to insert Christian and biblical teachings in the public school textbooks, and what they did is say, present both sides of an issue? And that means we're injecting Christian and biblical teachings in the public school textbook. So again, this is a backhanded diss at Christians. You know, they're saying, hey, these fundamentalists, they're creating a theocracy down in Texas. No, these guys actually did a good job of saying if it's controversial, present both sides. And by the way, I had that when I was doing the history standards here. You know, of course, I got beat up for saying I'm trying to inject Christianity. And I remember one of the things that particularly the left went through the roof over that I was injecting Christianity in was a very simple little thing where the teachers had suggested that we take the mention of the holiday of Christmas out of the textbooks. And since that is a major holiday, and it is a federal holiday, and it is celebrated by more people than any other holiday, any other religious holiday, I just said, no, let's not take it out. Let's keep it in. Oh, you're trying to inject Christianity. No, I'm just trying to keep the mention in there that we've had for decades of a holiday and not take it out. I'm trying to prevent the scrubbing of it. And so it really is kind of a weird thing, the way they spin this and the way they look at it. But that's the way it is with this article. And so while this, and by the way, I was going to mention that what we did in the history side was not in Texas, but another state where I was helping do their standards. When we got to the 50s and 60s era, and we're talking about McCarthy and McCarthyism, the teachers were all for, yeah, we got to teach kids about McCarthyism. Yeah, absolutely. And you also need to make sure you point out that the Republican Senate censored McCarthy for the way he handled witnesses, but you also have to put in the Venona papers. And they looked at me and said, Venona what? The Venona papers. You don't know what the Venona Papers? No, we never heard of the Venona Papers. Venona Papers are the papers that were released by the Soviet Union after the wall came down that document the number of Soviet spies they had in Hollywood and all these other places, that McCarthy was really onto something. He just went about it in a very crude, very mean-spirited way, but there was actually a spy. Well, we didn't learn about that ourselves, so we don't want to teach the kids that. Now, that's indoctrination. I mean, if you're going to do one side, whack McCarthy all you want to, but also point out that there were actually Soviet spies at the time that were trying to undermine America, and so put both sides. And that's what Texas did in the biology book. But for other guys who apparently don't use their brains and don't want to go into a story, the story is that Texas said, we want to make sure that there is no indoctrination, that kids get a chance to make a choice on information from both sides. And this is a textbook that did not do that, and so we're not taking this textbook in Texas because it didn't give both sides of an issue. And so suddenly that's fundamentalist, cramming their religion down everybody else's throat. So the good news is that we did reject an indoctrination textbook in Texas, but that's not the way the story was spun.
Yeah, and the good news is that that's going to have huge impacts down the road. Not the story, I'm back to the textbooks itself. It's going to have huge impacts a generation later, because
that's right.
You're going to have kids not only that are able to think because they're being presented with both sides instead of just having one side indoctrinated into them. Not only will you have kids able to think, but they will be exposed to truth. They'll get both sides and have a chance to decide for themselves. But the fact that you're getting truth into the classroom in and of itself is a positive. So lots of good news there for the future of our state and, frankly, for the country, because Texas will continue to lead the way. Okay, I made all our other stations mad outside of Texas, but I think they know Texas is leading the way. And with that, we're going to go to a break. We'll get some more good news for you when we come back here on WallBuilders Live.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court recently overturned the jury sentence of a man convicted of the brutal murder of a 71-year-old woman because the prosecuting attorney had mentioned a Bible verse in the courtroom. Yet consider what happened in the 1778 case, Respublica versus John Roberts. Thomas McKean, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, was the Chief Justice of that court, and addressing John Roberts after the jury had sentenced him to death for treason, McKean told him, "You will probably have but a short time to live. Before you launch into eternity, it behooves you to repent of your evil deeds, to be incessant in prayers to the great and merciful God to forgive your manifold transgressions and sins, to teach you to rely upon the merit and passion of a dear Redeemer." This prominent founding father actually delivered a salvation message to the defendant in the courtroom.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us here at WallBuilders Live. It's Good News Friday today, which means we're bringing you good news from around the nation. We started off, David, with good news out of Texas and the education system there and teaching both sides of these issues so the students can learn to think. How about some more good news?
Well, we talked last week about how that polling works on abortion issues, and we looked at national polling on abortion, and it was the Marist poll, and we mentioned that Rasmussen has them, and Gallup has them, and Pew has them, and all these other groups. But in the Marist poll, they specifically looked at those who support abortion on demand. What numbers were that? Well, now here's a Pew poll. Pew Research Center has released a poll, and it is, do you think abortion is moral or immoral? And when they ask the question of whether abortion is moral or immoral, by a margin of 3-1, Americans believe that abortion is immoral. 49% think that it's immoral, 15% think that it is moral, and 23% didn't think it was a moral issue. So those who think it's moral one way or the other, 3-1 margin in favor of those who believe that abortion is immoral. Now, that's good news as far as the thinking on what's right and wrong. In other words, those who definitely believe there's a right or wrong to abortion, not ambivalent on it, but those who believe it's right or wrong, 3-1 margin in favor of those, and it's larger than any of the groups. It's twice as large as the group that says, well, we don't know if it's a moral issue or not, and it's 3 times as large as the group that said, well, we think that it is a moral issue. So that's interesting, but also tucked within this, do you know what the greatest indicator of whether someone thought it was moral or immoral? The one thing that indicated whether they said it's moral or immoral, you know what that would be?
I'm gonna go with age.
Not
No?
age.
No, it wasn't age.
It was
Okay.
not age.
It wasn't an age demographic. So was it a faith issue, whether they were...
It was a faith issue, but take it a step further. It's not whether you're a Christian or a Jew or whether you profess some
how much
religious
you attend
faith.
church or other
That's
services.
it.
Yeah.
It's how frequent. The more frequently you attend church, the more you felt that it was immoral. The less frequently you attended church, the less you felt it was. For example, if you look at just Catholics, well, for Catholics who attend Mass at least once a week, 74% of them thought that abortion was immoral. But for Catholics who attend Mass, when they get around to it, only 40% of them thought that it was immoral. So there's a huge difference, and that was across all the religious groups, that if you're active in church attendance, you're more likely to recognize something as being moral and immoral, which I find very striking, not just for abortion, but for every other issue in the nation, that if you're in church, you're more likely to have a moral basis, a moral compass, if you will, for what constitutes right and wrong, rather than a libertarian compass that says, well, whatever you want to do is fine. So I find that to be a good news that, church is having an impact on those who think. And as this poll points out, one of the other aspects of this is because you have so much larger group that thinks it's immoral, that's actually affecting doctors. And there's fewer and fewer doctors willing to do abortions, and especially the younger ones. The younger ones coming in, it's pretty amazing that the younger ones think that. And given that, because it's interesting that here's where public schools comes in. You asked about the age difference. For those that were under 50 years old, they were less likely to think that it was immoral. In other words, they thought it was okay. If you're under 50, you've been to public school in the last 3 decades, you think that abortion, you're more likely to think that abortion is moral, but those are also the ones that are not as frequent in church as well. And so it really is, it's kind of all, this would be cross-tabbing in a poll for those that know what that means. I mean, religion plays into this, education plays into this, age plays into it, but that's only because you went through an educational system different in the last 30 years than before that. But bottom line is, if you are in church, if you are getting exposed to church teachings, whether that be Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, or whatever, you're more likely to have a sense of what constitutes right and what constitutes wrong. And that's good news for the influence of the church. We just need more people in church.
And it's a reminder for all of us that care about the nation and care about the culture that it goes back to what you've been saying for years. It's got to be an Ezra and Nehemiah approach. You can't just focus on the government and political realm. You can't just focus on the spiritual and church realm. You've got to do both, because the more people we have going to church and following the Word of God, the more likely that they're going to vote and get involved the right way and have the principles and the values that will bring the nation back. So
that's exactly right.
Got to do both.
And again, bottom line is that of those who take a moral position on abortion, those who believe it's immoral are ahead by a 3-to-1 margin, and that's good news.
Great news. Quick break. We'll be back with more good news here on WallBuilders Live.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. Christians have always believed that the greatest life-changing experience available to any individual is a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and the testimonies of numerous converts confirm the dramatic changes which often accompany salvation. One such testimony of change comes from founding father Noah Webster, who explained, "I was led by a spontaneous impulse to repentance, prayer, and entire submission and surrender of myself to my Maker and Redeemer. I now began to understand and relish many parts of the Scriptures which before appeared mysterious and unintelligible. In short, my view of the Scriptures, of religion, of the whole Christian scheme of salvation, and of God's moral government are very much changed. The power of God to change a life yielded to Him was just as evident at the time of the Founding Fathers as it still is today."
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us here on WallBuilders Live. Good News Friday today, so we're bringing you good news from around the nation. David, what's our next good news item?
Well, this is is a spin-off, a continuation of the previous item. It doesn't deal with abortion, but it does deal with morals. And this deals with Minneapolis, and it deals with the guy up there, this guy's named Brian Johnson. And for a number of years, he goes to the Gay Pride Fest in Minneapolis, the Twin Cities Pride Fest, and he passes out Bibles. And so he's had a booth there, and it's a public meeting in a public setting, in a public park, and all the public stuff. And so he gets a booth there, and he gives out Bibles at that booth. And so from 1998 to 2009, that's 12 years inclusive, he gave away Bibles at this booth he had in the festival, never had any problems. But then the organizers of that festival, they started saying, what do you believe? I mean, you're giving out Bibles, what do you believe? And they found out that he actually thought that homosexuality was a sin. He thought there was a moral right and wrong. And so suddenly the next year in 2009, they would not let him have a booth. They wouldn't let him be part of this public setting, public park, etc. And so he was not allowed a booth, but he still attended the festival, and he put on a T-shirt that said free Bibles. And so he would hand out free Bibles. Well, walking around the park handing out free Bibles, the city park, the police came to him and said he's not allowed to do that, and so he was arrested for handing out free Bibles in the park. And so at that point, he goes to our friends at Alliance Defending Freedom, and they get involved. And what happened as this thing went along, the park said, well, we'll let you have a free speech zone. You can have this little corner over here about 23 miles away from the park. Not really, but they always put these guys in a corner back where nobody goes, and says, that's your free speech zone.
Wait a minute. Wait, back up. Did he even get an apology for being arrested for simply handing out Bibles in the park?
Oh, no. Well, no. You don't get that kind of apology. I mean, these guys were obviously forced to put him back in against their will. I mean, this is, if there is a thing that concerns me with law enforcement, and we covered this a few weeks ago with the Second Amendment, how many sheriffs would not enforce a law. It was over 70% said they would, and it wasn't just sheriffs. The law enforcement officials said if a law is passed that restricted gun access, they would not enforce that law. Well, that's because the Constitution is pretty clear on the Second Amendment. Our problem is we don't know what the First Amendment is. And so there's way too many law enforcement folks that just arrest somebody for free speech or arrest them for sharing their faith or whatever. And if they knew the First Amendment as well as the Second Amendment, then it's because you should only be engaging in what's called lawful arrest. I mean, I don't mean to make this the equivalent, but the Nuremberg defense that was used was that the Nazis said, well, we were told by our superiors to do this. And that didn't hold up. You have to understand what a lawful order is. And if you're given an unlawful order, you don't obey an unlawful order. I mean, it doesn't hold up to say, well, my superiors told me to do it. But that's what we're having way too much of right now is, and whether that be with the little standoff that happened in Nevada, out there with the stuff. Well, I agree with Clive and Bundy and those guys, but my superiors told me I had to do something. No. Lawful orders. Now, I'm not saying whether Bundy was right or wrong on that, but the notion that just because I'm told to do something means I have to do it. And so that's kind of where we are with Brian Johnson. They said, okay, we'll release you, but now you have to stand over in a corner in the park and you don't get to be part of anything. You don't get to be close to any people. So, ADF said, no, you can't do that. That's unconstitutional. And so when it kept going, ADF finally filed suit against the city. Now, the district court there, a federal district court, ruled that what the city was doing was constitutional, that they could restrict him to a corner, that they could keep him from passing out Bibles. So then ADF appealed it to the Eighth Circuit, and at the Eighth Circuit came down and pounded the lower court and said, no, you do not restrict him. This is, as they said, it's a public festival on public land. He doesn't get stuck back in a corner where nobody is just because you don't like religious speech, right and wrong speech. And he wasn't even doing that. He was just giving out Bibles. So just the fact that he personally doesn't believe in homosexuality, he's giving out Bibles. He did that for 11 years, and they didn't know what he believed until they asked him. But once they found out what he personally believed, then he's not allowed to give out Bibles anymore. I mean, you can't do that kind of stuff. And so our friends at ADF did get involved, and this is a victory. So Brian Johnson now gets to hand out Bibles at the Twin Cities Pride Fest, and he doesn't have to be in a back corner to do it. So the courts are continuing to come down on the side of religious expression, religious faith, religious beliefs. We've talked before how that over 90 lawsuits now have been filed against the Obamacare mandate, and how that 90% of those 90 cases have been in favor of religious liberty, religious protection. So that is a positive trend going in the nation, but what happened out of Minnesota is another indication of that positive trend that's going, and that both free speech win and freedom of religion win as well.
Well, I know it's Good News Friday. I hate to point out a negative, and that's just simply for those people that sometimes question us when we say, hey, it seems like every other week we're doing a program on WallBuilders Live where a pastor's getting arrested or some other person of faith arrested for handing out Bibles or simply praying on a public sidewalk. Just another example of that being done. These are real challenges, but the good news is when these guys from Alliance Defending Freedom and other organizations step in, the law and the Constitution are on our side. They are on our side when we fight those battles. So excellent news. We've got to take a quick break. We'll be back with more good news here on WallBuilders Live.
Hey guys, this is Tim Barton with WallBuilders, and I know you hear my dad and Rick talk a lot about our founding fathers, about the original intent of our nation, the constitutional heritage that we have, and really we've seen how far we've slipped away from that. And I know a lot of us, as we hear my dad and Rick talk, think, I wish there was a place that I could go and I could see these documents and I could read and learn about the founding fathers firsthand, see the things they did. And I want to give you some websites today that can help you accomplish that very thing. If you get online, you can go to places like Library of Congress and you can look under their Century of Lawmaking or historical documents. You can go to the Avalon Project, to the Founders Constitution, to Google Books, or even the Internet Archives, or you can just go to WallBuilders' website. We have a section for our library, and under that section we have different subgroups for historical documents, historical writings, even a place where you can get helpful links to find out more information about other websites where you can do research for yourself and find the truth for yourself. Friends, this is a time that we need to know who we are and where we came from. WallBuilders.com is a great place to go.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us here on WallBuilders Live. We got one more segment. Time for a little bit more good news, David.
Now, this is a strange one, and it follows with the last comment you made before we went to break. By the way, when I say EEOC, what strikes you?
Another government, I don't know, another government bureaucracy. I can't even remember which one it is.
Do you think favorably of this? I mean, do you think these guys like the U.S. military, I mean, that's a government agency?
No.
You think more of these like the TSA?
Yeah,
and the
I think
IRS,
in terms of EPA or yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly where I am. And yet, good news, according to the EEOC, employers can no longer discriminate against cross-wearing Christians.
Okay, so that must mean that, okay, now I'm remembering what it is. The employee
Equal Employment Opportunity
Commission. That's it. Yeah. Okay. All right, go ahead.
Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. This is where all the liberal agenda stuff has been running through.
Wait, they came down with a good. You said that decision came from them. This wasn't a
Yes.
decision against them. This was a decision from them.
This is like the Ninth Circuit making a good decision. The EEOC, they normally come down with really bad decisions, and they did this, and they said employers can't discriminate against cross-wearing Christians. And I said this because as you went out, you say, people give us a hard time for saying, oh, you're talking about another arrest of a pastor. That doesn't happen all that much. Well, EEOC spokesman said that there has been a 20-year trend of a persistent uptick in religious discrimination charges. And the complaints have more than doubled just since 1997. Now, this is not a faith-friendly organization we're talking about here. These are the guys that usually whack us right and left, and even they say that there has been a 20-year increase in religious discrimination. And quite frankly, last year, in 2013, which is the last year they record, they received 3,721 charges alleging religious discrimination, and in 1997 it was only 1,709 charges. And when these things went to court and they were settled, apparently there must have been some real discrimination going on, because there was $11.2 million given in judgments, and that was last year. And then back in 2001 it was $14.1 million. And in 2011, it was $12.6 million. That's not small bucks that are being given out. So guess what? This really has been a problem. And quite frankly, I did not know the quantities of judgments in so many cases totaled that much money. And quite frankly, I didn't know that it had been, 3,700 charges that they had just last year, and just below 4,000 on religious discrimination. I mean, we knew it was high, and we knew that religiousHostility.org lists more than 1,200 incidents over the last many years. But to have nearly 4,000 in 1 year, and to have the EEOC come out and say, no, you cannot discriminate against Christians wearing crosses at the workplace. I mean, that's just pretty amazing.
It's, you know, I did not realize that there were so many complaints going through the EEOC. I mean, I always think of these religious liberty cases as being straight into federal district court, because most of the cases we talk about here on the program, that's where they come from. I had no idea there were so many that were actually employee versus employer, vice versa, in that environment.
Yeah, I didn't realize that either. And usually most of the things we see going through EEOC are union-type things, pushing union stuff, or, you know, some conservative is limiting my free speech as a liberal or whatever it is. And it usually is a very liberal ruling organization. But the fact that they've been overwhelmed by, you know, 3,700 a year, and even though it was 1,700 back in 97, still that's going at least 2,000 incidents a year on religious discrimination being filed, charges being filed. I had no clue it was that many. But that's the answer to those that you mentioned last segment. Say, oh, you know, here you are again talking about another pastor arrest. Well, now you got a liberal government agency, the EEOC, saying, well, we get about 3,700 last year, and here's our position. Our position is you can no longer discriminate against Christians who wear crosses in the workplace, which if they come out with a ruling like that, that tells me a whole lot of those complaints must have been about people not being able to wear earrings or jewelry or religious symbols or have a religious bumper sticker or whatever it was. And so, again, that's amazing. It's good news, but it verifies how much hostility is actually out there.
More good news. We're out of time for today. You can get more good news at our website, wallbuilderslive.com. Click on the archives. Catch those Friday programs. Lots of great news to share with you there. We appreciate you joining us on WallBuilders Live.
We stand under